little bit. All right, so we are into the Pentateuch. As far as structuring this Old Testament course, this Old Testament survey, this will be section 2. Section 1 was the introductory matters, inspiration, canon, the historical world that the Bible was formed in. Now we get into the Pentateuch in section 2. And so if you choose to use the note guide, it says 2.1 Genesis, that is section 2, the first group of notes. And if you're really bright and reading ahead, 2.2 notes will be the book of Exodus. So if that helps it make sense, and so forth as we go through. There'll be 5 sections of notes that we will eventually get through. Though we are in Bible study, we're not in a hurry. We're driving below the speed limit, trying to understand God's Word and benefit from it. So as you see, the title is Genesis. Genesis is from the Latin word, I believe, or is Genesis Greek? I believe it's Latin, meaning beginnings. You see down at the bottom of the screen, you see the Hebrew, and the Hebrew word is Bereshit. In the Hebrew Bible, this is called Bereshit. Ba is in with or by. Rosh is the head. So Bereshit is very literally would be in the head, in the beginning. The head is the top, the beginning, in the beginning, which is the way that the Bible begins, the book of Genesis begins. Now, for each Bible book that we go through, I give my students what I call Old Testament book cards. And those are on your note guide. Now, if you wanted to, I have a template to put all the book cards on like 3 pieces of paper. If you wanted to collect those. Another thing that students do sometimes, in order to have this information about each book, they'll put them on note cards. And I've seen they got little rings, they'll punch holes in them and put them on rings, so that for whatever reason somebody says, I want to know something about the book of Nahum, you can flip to your Nahum card and look at the information just to give you a summary of what that book is about. Now, of course, Genesis is book card number 1. I don't require any of you to keep the book cards, but I'm just telling you, when we get to the book card, that's the thing there. At the end of the course, my course, they have all 39 books of the Bible, a quick summary. The information I give on each book card is, of course, the title of the book, then the purpose, a brief purpose for the book. And that's a lot easier for some books than others. You know, a big book like Genesis, the purpose to show God's as sovereign creator who loves his children. That's a very broad purpose. There's lots of sub-purposes. Other books that are rather short, it's fairly easy to summarize and give a purpose for. But this is an attempt to just give people a summary. Then I'll give key text. I'll pick 1 to 3 to 4 text that kind of epitomizes what that book is trying to do. And the 3 for Genesis are well known. Genesis 1:1 in the beginning. Genesis 3:15, of course, is called the Proto-Evangelion. And he turns to the serpent after sin and gives consequences. And he says to the serpent, your offspring, your seed shall have enmity, shall be enemies with the offspring of the woman. That is humanity. The serpent is going to be at odds with humanity. And of course, we'll see this, we'll go over this first, but it is singular, masculine singular. Your seed shall stomp his head, and he shall strike his heel. And so I, of course, interpret the seed as Jesus eventually coming, and he will win the victory, crushing the head of the devil's purposes to cause people to sin and rebel against God. But the serpent shall bite his heel, meaning sin is going to plague humanity until Jesus comes back. So on the cross, Jesus won the final victory, but that final victory of him returning for the second time is slow to get here. It hasn't happened yet. And so we have to endure. We are being bitten in the heel now as we go through life. And then, of course, Genesis 12:3 is God calling Abraham and telling him, through you, I'm going to bless the whole world. In Genesis 22, he says, through your seed, I'll bless the whole world. The one sentence summary, probably after this, rather than one sentence summary, I'll have OSS, but that is taking the whole book of Genesis and doing it in one sentence. God, who created mankind and punished rebellion, that's sin, with death, began his great plan for redemption with his covenant to Abraham, who arrived in Egypt as God's cherished people. Now, that's just a quick summary. But God created, then man, and put him in the garden. Man rebelled and sinned, bringing death as part of our life equation. We are going to die from this current life we live in. But he began a great plan of redemption with Abraham. And if you remember when we did the study of the fall of man, the critical thinking exercise, and I said the Bible is kind of like a text from God, that's when he begins that great plan of redemption, where he says, come home. Come home. I'm going to make a way for you to come home to me. Come back into the garden. And so that's the way the Bible begins. So let's start in the first 11 chapters. The first 11 chapters are called by scholars the primeval history. And so what that means is these first 11 chapters are what happened in the world before we kind of had history. If you remember, we talked about the Sumerians and the Egyptians began writing about 3000 BC. Well, there was stuff that happened before 3000 BC, and most of it wasn't written down. We have no record of it. Primeval history is what happened to mankind before we began writing the Bible down. Now, you will note as we go through this, it begins with creation, where God is creating all people. And so the primeval history, it has a wide lens focusing on the whole world, people of every ethnicity and every system of belief. It is very interesting at chapter 12 in Genesis, the call of Abraham, the camera lens focuses down on the Hebrew people. And we follow the Hebrew people for the rest of the Old Testament. We get to the we go to the New Testament, and a Messiah comes, and there's a new religion that begins in the Hebrew people. But it spreads from the Hebrews to the whole world. And we get to the book of Revelation, and the camera lens widens out on the whole world. It starts just on those Christian churches, but then it widens out on God unveiling his plan to the whole world. So there is a symmetry to the Bible. It starts out all people, everywhere. And that's important because people often think of the Old Testament. One reason they find it less relevant to them is because they think of it as a book related to the Hebrews. And that's true in large measure. But it starts out before written history with a wide lens. It is a wide lens introduction of the Bible. All the great civilizations of the world have creation stories. And so the Bible is not unique talking about creation. That is a common thing in the great civilizations. And so talking about creation, the creation story is called a cosmogony, and you don't really need to know that word, but as I said, it's common to all different cultures in the ancient world. They had cosmogonies, creation stories, and there are many similarities, and I'll kind of point those out. We read it, most of us, the only creation story we've read is the Bible one, and so we miss things in there that other that other cultures had in their creation stories. And there are a lot of similarities. However, the Bible gives a very different implication than those stories, and we'll point those things out. Um, the the ancient Hebrews were citizens of their world, and so they thought about religion like in many ways like their neighbors did. And so a lot of the things they told were the same about God creating, was the same things their neighbor who didn't believe in Yahweh God told about their many, many gods. And so that's one of the kind of interesting things to me as we go through. So the Genesis story begins very, you're very familiar with Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now that phrase, well, in the beginning, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to stretch you a little bit, and this may aggravate you. This is where I get to be a little bit academic, and sometimes people don't like the Bible to be treated academically. But that phrase, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. How long was the beginning? We're going to talk about it. And I'm going to give you my theory, which you've heard in other places at various times. But how long? What I like to do, I've told you this over and over, I like to triangulate when I'm not sure. Anybody want to say how long the beginning was? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. How long was the beginning? All right. As I've said, I like to triangulate. If a word, I am not sure what a Bible word means, I like to look in the Bible where that word is used other places and look at the clues in those other places to see if we can figure out how long, or to figure out what a word means. So let's look at some words that use Bereshit, in the beginning. In Genesis chapter 10, not too long after this, still in the primeval history, Genesis 10, 9 and 10. Nimrod, the mighty hunter, describing Nimrod, and the beginning, the same word, of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Just pulling out a couple things that you do recognize. Babel is the Hebrew word for Babylon. And we get the word Babel from God confusing the languages in Babylon. Akkad, if you remember, we talked about the Akkadians in the Akkadian language, the Semitic language. So that was a center by that name, a city by that name. When it says in the land of Shinar, Shinar is Mesopotamia, in between the rivers. And so that whole fertile plain is called the land of Shinar. Now, focusing on the beginning. How long was the beginning of his kingdom? Ostensibly when he founded these cities. Nimrod went around founding cities. He was a mighty hunter, a warrior, a leader. How long would it take for him to build or start 4 cities in land? 20 years? And I'm speculating. There's not a right or wrong answer. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So should we say it took God about 30 years to make the heavens and the earth? I think we better keep looking. I'm not comfortable just jumping on 30 years as speculation. Let's look at another one. Genesis 43, and this is a little more vague, but Jacob calls in his 12 sons at the end of his life. This is at the end of the book of Genesis. And he begins giving blessings and curses to his sons, basically their spiritual inheritance. And when he hit Reuben, which if you break down the name Reuben, Ru is the word to see, and Ben is son. And so his name means, look, I have a son. Golly, I have a son, He says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the strength of my youth, my might in the beginning of my strength. Same word. Though that's a little bit vague, that's a little bit abstract to make that into a time period, but this is his youth, his vigor, so maybe a 5-year period when he was at the peak of his manhood. So that's a little bit different than 30 years. So there must be some range of meaning in that word. I don't know. I'm telling you the way that I would approach figuring out how long the beginning is. In Isaiah, way later in Isaiah, chapter 46, 9 and 10, this is a wonderful verse. Isaiah the prophet, and this is right after Isaiah 45, I believe it is, where he talks about God sending Cyrus of Persia to get the children of Israel out of captivity. Then in the next chapter, he says, remember the former things of old. And this is very helpful. This verse is helpful in talking about primeval history. What happened before we were writing things down? Remember the former things of old, for I am God. This is God talking to the people through the prophet Isaiah. And there is no other God being like me. A person who can, or a deity who can declare the end from the beginning. Now think about that. What is God saying there? You know, that tells me that God doesn't look like at time the way we do. That God is looking down, and at the end of time, he can talk about the beginning. At the beginning of time, he can talk about the end. He can see it all, declaring the end from the beginning. And from ancient times, things that are not yet done, I could tell you they're going to happen. Now, that's the God we know. We're very comfortable with that, right? So this is God looking at the whole span of existence, the beginning and the end. Now, scientists say, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, scientists say the Earth, the planet Earth, and they get this from the age of rocks, if they are correct in the way they age rocks, the Earth is 4.7 billion years old. So a billion is a million times a million. So you'd say a million years multiplied by a million times 4.7 is how old the Earth is. And I don't endorse that or dismiss it. That's not the purpose here. But God looking at declaring the beginning from the end, that's a man with a deity with lots of view, right? He can see a long way. So if that's true, and no matter what you think the beginning is, how long, about how long is God talking about for the beginning here? It's very hard to say, isn't it? I mean, that we're getting further away from, rather than nailing down a time period, we're getting further away from how long did it take God to create. It's getting less precise. A verse that this is the exact phrase in Jeremiah. It's in Jeremiah 26, I think 27 and 28. It's talking about Jehoiakim, which we've talked to. You remember the four sons of Josiah, who were the last kings, and this is Jehoiakim, and I believe Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years. It says, in the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, the king of Judah, this word came from Yahweh. So if Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years, how long was the beginning of his reign? A year? 6 months? So that narrows it down. You know, you think about this year is Sarah and I 25-year anniversary. And so when I talk about when me and Sarah first got married, in the beginning of our marriage, at 25, I could be talking about the first 5 years, couldn't I? Easily. When when we had only been married 2 years, and I said in the beginning of our marriage, I'm probably talking about the first couple months. How long was the beginning? Of course, in 28, and it happened the same year in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, in the 4th year in the 5th month. So we get a little more information here, don't we? Zedekiah reigned 11 years, but it says in the beginning of his reign, the 4th year, 5th month. So that's like the first half is the beginning. Could we say then, if we like science, could we say that when God says in the beginning, he created 2.35 billion years? And I'm being a little bit ornery, cantankerous in this, in saying I very much think the first verse of the Bible is the creation story. I've told you this before. The information that the author wants you to know is that in the beginning, in a beginning period of time, and he's not given, he could give technical data, but you know, technical data is a modern thing. Ancient people weren't worried about such things. In a beginning period of time, God created everything. And so how long was the beginning? That word heavens and earth is called a hendiades, where 2 words put together mean something different than the individual words mean. Basically, heavens and earth means everything that exists, the whole universe, all existence. And so, how long do you think the beginning was? I believe according to verse 1, it just said something like, I would translate the first verse thematically as in a beginning period of time. That the Bible author is not trying to be specific, and he's not trying to give us precise details. God created all that exists. I think that is the truth that beginning thing, the beginning phrase was trying to say. I think that beginning verse is the kind of the title of the book of the Bible, and the starting truth, the beginning truth that everything else in the Bible leans on. Every word of truth that comes after this phrase leans against this truth. That whenever stuff was created, God created all of it. He is the one creator. And God was not created. Now, I do believe there are other spiritual beings in the universe other than God, but they were created. Angels and demons were created by God. So what are the purposes of this beginning story? Well, number one, it identifies the Creator. Why do you exist? Yahweh God created you. Second, it gives a starting point for creation, an introductory statement, a basic premise. Starting point, introductory statement. It is the title and the thesis for the Bible. As I said, it is the starting point, the truth that everything else leans against. I think it's a huge phrase. And I think it is the whole creation story. And I think what comes after it that we call the creation story functions in a different way. Everything you need to know about the creation is that in the beginning, God created it. And then the third thing, and this is lost on modern people, because we live, the Bible has been around. Moses probably began writing the Bible 3,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago or so. And so for 3,500 years, the Bible has been affecting the way we think about God. And so we think monotheistically. Most of the world is monotheistic, one God. It was not when Moses began writing. Most people were polytheistic. The Bible has done its work. And one of its great works was to be a polemic against polytheism, against the idea that there are a bunch of gods. It is teaching people and I'll point it out a lot throughout the Old Testament. The authors are taking a lick at people who believe there are multiple gods and at multiple gods. The prophets mock polytheism. But I want you to watch as we talk about polytheism, the polytheistic cultures, which are most of the cultures around the Hebrews, behave a lot like people who reject Christianity behave. The polytheistic gods, as I said, it's kind of a designer religion where you find a deity that condones your behavior, the way you want to act. The gods are sinful. The polytheistic gods sin. And if your God sins, that kind of makes it okay for you to sin too, doesn't it? And so that's a big underlying thing that's going on in the Old Testament. So what is happening after verse 1? Creation story, verse 1. In the beginning period of time, God created all that exists. What happens in verse 2? And I've used this analogy with you before. It's kind of like looking at the house of a young married couple, and we see the guy's game room. He has a whole room, and he brings his buddies over, and they sit on the couch and they play video games, or they play foosball or something. And then all of a sudden, one day, the man starts moving that furniture out. They paint the walls pink, put pictures on there, and move new furniture in. Now we know, did that man just build a new house? No. He took the house that already existed and was changing it to welcome a special creation. That is what I think happens after verse 1. I think verse 1 tells us God created the world and everything in it. And then in verse 2, he begins making the world welcoming and good for his special creation. The blessed newcomer, humanity. God is modifying things to welcome his children in. And so I believe Genesis 1:1 is the creation story. Starting in verse 2 through 2:25 is the ordering of creation. So what was the condition of creation? In verse 2a, it says the earth. Now the earth is a modern world, and I've told you this in other talk about Genesis. I prefer, what it says in Hebrew is the land. Haaretz is the Hebrew word. The land was without form and it was void. And I've told you, because when I say the earth, we all see a globe. We all have seen photographs of the planet Earth. That's what we think about. Ancient people had not seen a photograph of the planet Earth. They probably had not seen I'm sure they had not seen a globe. They probably thought of the world as flat. And what technically, we have heavens and earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. But what it says in Hebrew is the land and the sky. So when you look out the window, what do you see? You see the land down there, and you see the sky up there. It means everything outside, everything that's outside. And that was our concept of the world. So I prefer the word land, but it did not have form. And the darkness was on the face of the deep. I've told you before that when ancient people, their cosmology, when they thought about what was here before God created the land, they thought of an ocean, a raging ocean, a storm at sea. And so the earth was here, the land was here, but it was like a big chaos ocean. You couldn't step on land, and it wasn't, there was nothing solid to stand on. And darkness was on the face of the deep. All right, there was no light. So you could not stand anywhere. You would sink into the water, and you could not see. That's very bad. But don't lose hope. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, as I said, all the different religions around the Hebrews had creation stories. And one of the ones that it's just they probably borrowed from other religions, other cultures, but is the Babylonian. They had for many centuries, the Babylonians had a play called the Enuma Elish, or the Epic of Atrahasis, and we have dug up this archaeology of a stone carving of this festival they would have. They would have a play reenacting this. And so what you're seeing there is the sea monster, the chaos monster called Tiamat, and that main creature there is the god Marduk. So for the Babylonians, Marduk was the creator god. And the way he created the earth, so there was nothing but this evil ocean, and man couldn't live in the ocean. And inside that ocean was this evil sea monster god that would eat anybody that it came upon. Well, Marduk killed it. They fought an epic battle, and he killed it. And then he cut its body half in two, and with half the body he made the sky, and with the other half of the body he made the land. And then human beings could live on the land, on the sea monster's body. Now, for these Babylonian gods, humans were created to be the slaves of the gods. So in the Enuma Elish was Marduk versus Tiamat, and Marduk used violence. He struck and killed Tiamat. And when you get to verse 2 of the creation, ordering of creation, it says, and the Spirit of God hovered above the ocean. And that is like that mythological battle. I have read people that said, originally the Bible said God attacked the ocean and beat the ocean, just like in the other mythologies. But nobody's ever found a copy of that Bible, because the Bible says something very different. Rather than using violence to make creation obey him, in the Bible, God speaks. And what happens when he says, let there be light? There was light. And so rather than having to hit and be violent and kill other gods, very competitive, and it justifies killing, it justifies assassination, the God of the Bible spoke, and he was of such power that creation obeyed him. Rather than human beings in the Bible being slaves. And so what they did in the mythologies of Babylon and other places, the people made sacrificed animals in order to feed the gods. The gods got very hungry. And when the humans didn't make sacrifices, the gods starved. But rather than human beings being slaves to feed God in the Bible, he said, humans are my children, not my slaves, my children, whom I love. In Genesis 1:26 through 28, God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them, talking about mankind in the plural, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea. I'm going to come back to that them. That's why I made it green. Let them have dominion over the birds of the air, the cattle, and all the earth, and every creeping thing. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So that word, going back up to the original them, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea. All right? That is very egalitarian, if you want to use that word. The creation story, before sin, there is an equality among male and females. And God gave both male and female dominion over the fish of the sea, because before sin, God had dominion. And God was the only one to lead mankind. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And so man was created in the imago Dei. That is the Latin word for the image of God. And God gave them, God's intent in creating man was to give him blessing. And so be fruitful and multiply, have kids, raise those kids up as I am raising you up. I believe that the way that we most reflect the image of God, the best that human beings can do, is for a God-fearing man, God-fearing woman to get married before, and you think about this whole thing that it's doing. Chapter 1 gave them dominion. Chapter 2, therefore a man shall leave his mother and father and cling together. Then to have kids and to raise those kids up as God is raising up Adam and Eve to know God and to interact with God and to think of creation in its created purposes, use the world the way it was intended to be used, that God is blessing them. And it says that God saw that everything that he gave mankind was good. And that is why people that want God to not be a part of the world tend to go after marriage. Because marriage is the foundation of the image of God in mankind. That's how we reproduce, it's how we continue, and it is meant to be the order and the structure for teaching right and wrong, for teaching morality, for teaching consideration, for teaching love in that context. Now, certainly, humanity sinned and rebelled, and marriage ain't all that it was cracked up to be in the Garden of Eden anymore. And there's a lot of holes you can punch in that because you view marriage through sin. But God's intention was to bless mankind through that structure. And it's deep in the structure. And there was equality in that relationship. All right, I think that's probably where we ought to knock off for today. A good place to pick up. The thought question is, what is the implication? Well, I kind of went into the implication. God meant for our lives to make sense to us. God meant for our lives to have purpose. And God meant for us to have all that we need in an uncompetitive situation, in a situation of equality, and all the things that people want today, and they seek through governmental means, through protest, through browbeating, through, I don't know, all the different ways, through wars, that we try to get those things, were the things that we were given in the created order by God, who loved us and desired to bless us. And let me tell you, God hasn't changed. God still desires to bless mankind, but we're not going to get that blessing by force. We're only going to get it by submission to God. God made submission easy on the cross and equal opportunity for all people. All people have equal access through the cross to the blessing of God. Any questions or comments as we close?
I'll just say Laura said she hadn't checked with Tyler in a couple of days, but he'd been doing good.
Good,
If
okay.
all worked with the surgery, recovery would take up to 6 months.
Okay. Okay, well, we'll certainly tell her we'll keep praying till she tells us that he's good. Anything else? All right, well, let's stop there and go ahead and say a prayer.